All right, how's everybody doing today? This week we're talking about sex and sexuality, and and so this is an interesting chapter to teach about. It can be kind of challenging, right? Because we will talk about a number of kind of controversial issues. Things about sexuality tend to be more controversial than a lot of topics that we discuss in sociology, right? And I do want to say at the beginning of this is, I am a sociologist, but I'm not a sociologist of gender, a sociologist of sexuality. So I guess I'm asking for a little mercy as I navigate these troubled waters, right? And because sometimes it can be hard to lecture, to discuss controversial issues without upsetting one group or the other, right? And I will do my best, but I do ask for a little bit of grace when it comes to this topic, right? Some of the first things that we're going to talk about is kind of, the biology and differences between males and females. But then we'll talk about cultural differences and how sexual behavior, although their biological processes obviously involved, but there are also important cultural processes. And many of those cultural processes have changed dramatically, and how we see these things has changed dramatically. And this is one of those chapters that there has been significant social change in my lifetime. Now, it's not the only chapter that's like that. When we talked about media and social media and stuff like that, there have been significant social changes in the last 20 or 30 years as far as those things, the internet and social media and all those types of things. But when it comes to sex, sexual behavior, sexual orientation, how people view sexual orientation, there has absolutely been a sea change, right? And in that itself, like, some people will think that's a good thing, some others might think it's a bad thing, right? And so you can see how things are going to get controversial quick, and I'll try to shoot straight right down the middle as best as I can, right? All right, so I guess the best place to start is kind of, what is sex, right? Not the act, the behavior, right? But what are differences between males and females, right? So if you ask someone, what is their sex, right? That is a biological distinction, right? And I think most of us know this, but I guess I have to start somewhere, right? And so males have XY chromosomes, females have XX chromosomes, right? And typically, but not always, right? Males have penises, testicles. Females have vaginas, ovaries, right? Although there are some exceptions to that, right? And we'll talk about those, right? Now, that's sex. There's primary characteristics also and secondary characteristics. Those things that I mentioned so far are primary. But you'll remember when you're, maybe in middle school or early high school, and people start changing, right, as they mature biologically, right? And you start to see the appearance in men and or boys and girls' bodies, I should say. And these are secondary sex characteristics. For men, a little bit of mustache and stuff, and their shoulders get a little bit broader, and they carry more muscle in their upper torso. For females, well, they develop breast and their hips widen and stuff like that. For men, there's change in the voice, right? And those are secondary characteristics, right? The primary comes first, secondary comes later, right? And yeah, now that's sex, and we need to distinguish that from gender, right? Where sex is all about biology, gender is much more about culture, right? And there's lots of confusion about this because people tend to use sex and gender interchangeably, like they're synonyms and they mean the same thing, but they are not, right? And if you understand this, it will help you avoid all sorts of confusion, right? Gender refers to the personal traits, patterns of behavior, responsibilities, opportunities, privileges that a culture attaches to being female or male, right? And there are many, right? And we're socialized into gender roles, right? We're not socialized into sex roles, right? But into gender roles, right? From a very early age, we teach boys, how to act like a boy, and girls how to act like a girl, right? That's what we call gender socialization, right? And we have norms and expectations, right, for different genders. And whenever there's norms, remember we've talked about this over and over again. How do you know a norm exists? Well, if you violate it, then there's a sanction, right? And certainly there are all sorts of norms about how girls are supposed to act, and boys, and boys don't cry, and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, and we navigate all those social norms all the time. Some, I suppose, better than others. Some, some people are sanctioned, some are not, right? And even that, like, should people be sanctioned if they don't act in traditional gender norms? I mean, that's fraught with controversy right there, And certainly in the past they were, right? Sanctioned to a much greater extent than they are today, right? And we have become more permissive in our gender norms. And parents, not all parents, but some parents have less rigid ideas, right? So, if my son plays with a doll, I don't get upset about it, right? Maybe, that probably would have upset my dad, right? Yeah, and if girls play with action figures, or, girls want to play masculine sports or something like that, it's not as big a deal as it used to be, right? All right, there are all sorts of things that are like norms, right? Here's one that a professor of mine pointed out, right? If you go into high school, you start noticing things, and one of the things that differs between boys and girls is boys typically carry, all of their books, like, I don't know, like you have your book, and you carry it like this, right? Females didn't carry books like this, right? Now, there's nothing biological about that, right? That's not biologically determined by your sex, right? But that is those are gender differences in the way that people, and there's all sorts of gender differences in how people talk and communicate, what dress that they wear. Even before babies are born, we buy them pink and we buy them blue and stuff like that, right? And I'll tell you, having young kids, people expect them to be in blue or pink when they're young, and sometimes they'll even get upset, right? Now, this is not any bold statement about how I feel about this, although I do have feelings about this. But like at a certain point with both of my kids, I got tired of seeing blue and pink, right? And I started, buying clothes for them, and my wife bought clothes for them. They're like green and gray and stuff like that, right? And that don't conform to these norms, right? And I didn't think a whole lot of it. But you take your old baby out to Walmart and Target, and people will say things like, I can't tell if that's a boy. I was like, I don't care if you can tell or not, right? It's my child, right? And but people really expect that, right? They want it to be obvious and clear, right? They want their hair to be short or long or whatever, and this you see those expectations, right? And and I think we've all probably from time to time been sanctioned for acting in ways that are not consistent with gender norms, right? In fact, a lot of bullying is about this, right? All right. If you think about like all the horrible names that people call each other in middle school and high school, a lot of them are about gender expectations, gender norms, whether you act like you're supposed to as a man or you're not a man, or you're a woman or a lady or something like that, or not a ladylike and stuff. So gender norms are really they're pervasive, right? And and I'm like, they're pervasive and they're quite strong, but they're not as strong. There's not as much consensus as there used to be, right? So, earlier I said that typically males have certain genitalia and chromosomes and stuff like that. And that's how most people think about it, right? There's this one category, males, and there's this one category, female. But if you talk to biologists, they'll tell you these categories are not always neat and tidy, and it's not easy to place people into one box or another. There are people that are born and they can have genitalia that's ambiguous, or genitalia that's both male and female, right? And sexual organs like testicles and ovaries that are both male and female, right? And these people are typically called intersexual, right? And they are kind of, they don't neatly fit into this box. And they don't males neatly fit into this box, right? And they are born, they do exist, and this occurs more often than most people assume, right? I talked to a doctor, right, that delivers babies, and they've been practicing for a while. They've studied this, and they've probably seen it before too, right? Now, when it comes to, in essence, what that means is that there's not two categories, right, where everyone neatly fits into those categories, right? That's what binary means. Binary is like on and off switch, right? This or that, right? And if there exist people that are not this or that, and there does exist people like this that are born this way, they have been born, they live among us, right? And so that's an argument that, these things aren't as simple as most people expect them to be, right? And gender is also like that, right? There's the masculine, there's the feminine, right? And not everyone fits neatly into those categories either, right? There's some people that have masculine and female traits, right? And can be some fluidity between the movement of those. Some people think they don't have either masculine or feminine traits, right? And some people that are born biologically male or female might have an identity, right? Which we've talked about identity before and how that's socially constructed according to symbolic interactions. But they might have an identity that is not what most people would expect from a biological male, right? This is what we call transgender, right? And of course, this is quite controversial. I don't think it needs to be. It's not a new phenomenon, right? In fact, if you look at cultures around the world, this has been, a characteristic of a number of different cultures: India, Southeast Asia, Native American tribes. It tends to be really controversial right now in the United States, though, and I do recognize that, but it has not always been controversial in other cultures, right? The opposite of that is someone who was born male or born female, chromosomes, genitalia, and they act in ways that are consistent to expectations. And that's what we call cisgender, right? I mean, it just so happens, right, that I was born a male and I was socialized to act masculine. Sometimes I do act like a man. Sometimes maybe I don't live up to those expectations, but I am a cisgender, right? Yeah. All that means is that I have a gender identity that reflects the sex assignment that I had at birth, right? Yeah. And you see in part of that, like there's the biology part, but there's also the cultural part about expectations and norms and socialization and sanctions, right? Yeah. All right. It didn't take long before we got into controversial territory here. And I hope that you see that when people do not meet those gender norms, that oftentimes they're sanctioned, right? People in our society that are transgender have been subjected to all sorts of cruelty, right? They have been bullied. They continue to be bullied, right? It's one of the populations that's most likely to be victims of crime, right? And some people, I certainly don't, feel justified in meeting out those sanctions, right? And in the past, they felt much more justified, right? And that's something that's changing, right? And I tend to think that's a good thing, right? We need less cruelty in this world, right? Others disagree with me, and there lies a good bit of controversy, right? All right. I guess the next thing that we'll talk about, right, is, let me give you some instances of changing, how much things have changed, right? Well, one thing that we can talk about is changing meanings of virginity, right? And I don't know. This is less controversial, maybe a little bit controversial, right? Um, if you talk to your grandparents, right, and you talk to them about dating when they were young, and they might not even call it dating, they might call it something old fashioned like courting or something like that. And they'll tell you, your grandfather courted me, or, and that's what they would call that. And courting was a practice that led up to marriage, right? And dating is not, sometimes it leads up to marriage, but oftentimes it does not, particularly among college students, right? And this is fundamentally different, right? And a lot of this we've talked about, like people delaying marriage and stuff like that, particularly if they get an education, they delay marriage, right? So most college students are not really interested in getting married. They're not married. And maybe your great grandparents were probably married by 16 or 17 or something like that, right? I didn't get married myself until I was 42, right? So it took me a while before I got around to it, right? And I might be an extreme example of delaying, right? So what happens when people delay, and it changes the meaning of virginity all sorts of different ways. If you talk to your grandparents, your great grandparents, they would talk about their virginity as something, particularly among females, that you would want to retain for as long as possible. And it would help you, if you were a virgin, to marry a nice guy, right? I don't know exactly how dating norms are in college campuses, but I know in the 90s when I was a college student, there were very few people that were maintaining their virginity in college. There were some, right? Yeah, and when college boys or young men usually didn't have that expectation, right? And it didn't have, to have had sexual experience, right? Did no longer carry any stigma like it used to back in the 40s and 50s when your great grandparents were alive and stuff like that, right? And that's how the meaning of virginity has changed, right? It has fundamentally changed, right? Certainly by the time that I met my wife and was dating, and I was in my early 40s and stuff like that, I was no longer had any reasonable expectations to marry a virgin, right? And yeah, right. It's just, and you probably don't either, right? And that's a great example of how things have changed, right? Now there are some subcultures, like pockets of subculture, that do attempt among kind of fundamentalist, conservative Christian denominations where they have promise rings and they go to these balls and they promise their father that they will maintain their virginity until they meet a husband and stuff like that. And you might have grown up in those, right? I did not, right? And yeah, and it's usually the women they're expected to make their promise to maintain their virginity. There's no similar practice for young boys, right? And yeah, and in a lot of ways, even those people often do not maintain their virginity until they get married, even though I suppose they're trying and their parents are putting certain pressures upon them, right? So that's one thing. That's one way that's changed, right? People become sexually active at much younger ages, right? And people have many more sexual partners typically over their lifetime, right? You know, whether you think that's good or bad or you're indifferent to it, it is true, right? And there are people that research sex and, ask these questions, right? Yeah, I guess on like social media, people talk about body counts and stuff like that. I've always been amazed that people will answer that on a public street. Like, stranger walks up to you, we're not going to discuss this, right? Why would I discuss that with a stranger? Yeah. And you should probably expect to be lied to if you force someone to talk about that. Yeah, so there's a couple of differences. People delay marriage. People are more likely to be married more than once. Children are more likely to grow up in kind of blended families, right? And, I have stepbrothers and stepsisters and stuff like that. Although my parents didn't divorce. My mother died when I was 20 years old. And, and that's increasingly common. That was not as common when I was growing up in the 70s, right? Divorce was considerably more rare, right? And, you might think that's that it would be great if we could just keep people together, right? And there was lots less divorce. But I'm not sure about that either, right? When I was growing up, lots of people would stay together even though they hated each other, even though they fought every month, right? That's not really good for kids or for the husband and wife either, right? Other changes, the possibility that people of the same sex can get married, right? When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, that did not seem like it was even a possibility. But it is the law of the land now, right? And so, someone that grew up in the 70s and 80s, that I was surprised by that, right? I didn't think we would see that much social change and homosexuality and relationships within same sex would become normalized to that extent, right? Yeah, it's a little bit surprising for me, right? I think a great thing, though, and I certainly have many neighbors, many friends, and stuff like that, and other people might disagree with me about that, right? What else should I talk about as instances of social change? Well, I guess we can talk about, how just overall things have, at some point in the late 60s, became increasingly permissive, right? And if you know a little bit about the 60s and hippies and counterculture and stuff like that and free love movement and it feels good, do it, and stuff like that. And these ideas were quite popular when I was a young kid, right? Now, by the time I got into high school in the 80s, right, that sexual revolution had in some ways kind of played out, and sometimes cultural movements can be like a pendulum, right? Much more permissive during the 60s, and particularly the late 60s and the 70s, and then the pendulum moves back, and that's what we call the sexual counter-revolution, right? And this is really when I was growing up. There are a number of things that happen. Some people thought that we had erred too much on permissiveness. There was also the emergence of AIDS as a disease, right? And I'll tell you, it was a very scary disease in the 80s, right? And I had friends that contracted it and friends that died in a very short amount of time, and it was a horrible, painful death, right? And it's not like today where you can be treated and you can have a normal life and appear, healthy and feel healthy and stuff like that. In the 80s, it was, you were likely to die within a year or two, right? And unfortunately, I saw that happen to a number of my friends, really. And so that, and because it was transmitted sexually, but also during the 80s, it was transmitted also blood transfusions and things of that. And in the 80s, we didn't really know at the beginning of it how it was transmitted, and there were some people that were afraid that, if you were in close contact with people or if you shared a bathroom with them. Now we know, you can't transmit AIDS that way, right? But there was just a lot of fear and anxiety in society. And that explains probably to a great extent this kind of conservative backlash away from permissive norms about sexual behavior, more sex, unusual sexual practices, or at least not mainstream, right? More partners, relationships outside of marriage and stuff like that, right? Of the 60s, and then it swings back, and people do reduce their number of sexual partners during that time, and also kind of refrain from having sex out of committed relationships, right? And that makes sense because it was, at least thought to be much more dangerous at that time, right? Now, the 80s were also a kind of conservative moment in other ways, right? These were the years that Ronald Reagan was president, 80 to 88, right? And, and there was this kind of general call, like, return to family values and stuff like that, right? And so rather than sexual permissiveness, it's more the emphasis is placed upon responsibility and stuff like that. Both values are important to society and have their role, but different people feel, slightly one way or another, right? And at different times, and maybe even different moments of the day, feel like one value, or a mixture of the two values kind of sways, right? And adults often feel, don't do like I did, but, tell the kids to do better, don't follow me and stuff like that. And men often, permissive in their own behavior and judgments of others, but less permissive of females, that kind of double standard in gender norms that we always see between men and women. And you also see that with, like, the meaning of virginity, right? You had some other things like the feminist movement that entered into this sway back and forth between permissiveness in terms of sex norms and less permissiveness, right? Where we are now, oh boy, I think we've seen increasing permissiveness since the 80s. Although, we've certainly seen increasing permissiveness in a lot of ways, but maybe not in all ways. And there are certain, elements of our subcultures that have vastly different views about sexual permissiveness, right? But I think if you think about college students, like much more permissive, like, you're not, if someone tells you they hooked up with someone, they met them that night and they engaged in the act, so to speak, right? Are college students shocked by that, right? Because hooking up is having sex without social obligations, kind of in a way. There's no expectation that this is going to lead to marriage and stuff like that. That's permissiveness, right? And I think that's probably kind of the norm among college students now. And there's lots of research that shows that, right? And it's kind of, and there are a number of reasons that can kind of explain that too. And some of it is technological, right? Some of it's the role of education, people delaying marriage, right? And people often delay marriage until after they're through with their education, right? For a lot of you that are watching this video, maybe you'll get married after you have a bachelor's degree. But for other people like myself, you're going to get a master's degree and a PhD. And so, like, among professors, it's not unusual to find people that wait until their 30s and 40s to get married for the first time, right? Among medical doctors, lawyers, and things of that sort. More educated people delay marriage in childbirth, right? And one bit of technology that we should talk about that enables this is the pill, the birth control pill. Right, and that emerges during kind of the first sexual revolution, and continues, right, to have a huge influence upon society, sexual encounters, right, delaying childbirth and delaying marriage and stuff like that. Because we had contraceptives before the pill, but what's different about the pill? Well, it is completely under the control of the female. Unlike other things like condoms, right? The female can take birth control pill, and she doesn't have to tell anyone, right? She doesn't even have to tell her husband, right? It's completely under her control, right? Another thing, that makes it different is it does not affect the pleasure of having sex. Let's put it that way. In any way, right? And so what happens is sex and procreation become divorced from each other, right? A kind of family metaphor, right? But they become separated, right? And so sex does not carry the same risk of pregnancy and having children, right? And because it doesn't carry those risks, people can engage in it for other reasons, such as pleasure, right? Rather than just procreation, right? Now, birth control has always been controversial, right? It enables females to be less dependent upon males, right? It enables them to continue their education, right? It enables them to become financially independent before childbirth, or to not have children at all, right? And those are really important effects of this one bit of technology, right? And it's difficult to overstate how important that is, right? All right, so I guess the next thing that we're going to talk about is, we've already talked about a few controversial things, but the next thing that we'll talk about is I suppose, somewhat controversial, but we're all adults here, right? And we can talk about sexual orientation, and we can do that in a mature way, right? We haven't talked about this yet, right? Maybe made allusions and references to it, but we have not talked about sexual attraction and sexual orientation, right? And sexual orientation is about being attracted to another person, another type of person, right? It is not about engaging in sexual behavior, although that often is entailed in this, right? And you know, I already said I was a cisgender male, so I was born a male, and I was, you know, my doctor said it's a boy, right? And I think I do. Maybe some people are more masculine than I am, I'm sure, but I think I express myself in masculine ways, and I dress in masculine ways. I groom myself in masculine ways and stuff like that, right? But I've told you that I'm married and I have kids. I think that's come up multiple times. And, you know, and my wife is a female. And all the things that you probably assume looking at someone that looks like me, right? So I am a heterosexual male, right? But there's all sorts of variation among human beings, right? And you know, I imagine we all have friends that are males that are sexually attracted to other males, and females that are sexually attracted, right? And people that are sexually attracted to both sexes, right? That's the variety, right, of sexual orientations, right? And so most of us know at this point in our life, I'm sure I'm not teaching you this, that homosexuality is a sexual attraction to someone of the same sex. Bisexuality is the attraction to someone of both sexes, right? Yeah. There is also, and this might be something that I do teach you, there are also people that are not attracted to either sex, right? And that's called asexuality. And I have found that through teaching this class over the years that a lot of times people are most surprised about that. Like they just find it difficult to imagine. But there are people that really have no feelings of sexual attraction to either sex, right? And yeah. So where does our, sexual attraction come from, right? Most people, the consensus among most experts is that, like Lady Gaga said, we're born this way, right? And I think there's something to this, although it can be difficult to point to evidence that, just conclusively ends the debate, right? But most people, the consensus is that most people are born and they're attracted to this. And people report these experiences of knowing from a very early age and things of that sort. And it also does seem to be somewhat fixed, although there are examples of people that, believe that they were sexually attracted to one gender and then later changed, right? Whether that is really change or they're bisexual the whole time or, I guess that's up for debate, right? But most people think that, it is largely biological, but there are cultural influences in that, right? Oh boy, here's another example of like how much things have changed, right? And I don't think students often realize this, or people, in their late teens, early 20s often realize this. But when I was young in the 80s, and it was a kind of conservative moment, I certainly knew people who were homosexual, right? But they were often, they lived their lives in the closet, right? So they were not, as far as public identity, homosexual, right? That still happens today, but it happens far less, right? Certainly new people that were homosexual in high school, right? But they did not tell other people in high school, right? They might disclose that to a few close friends that they trusted, right? But they wouldn't let adults know. They wouldn't let their own parents know, right? So society in that regard, right? And I think a lot of times that people, young people today, think, oh, those people just weren't brave, right? And people today are much braver. I don't know about that, right? People had good reasons not to disclose their feelings of sexual attractions to others, right? Because here's what happened when people did that. When I was growing up in the 80s in a small town in Alabama, right? They were often shunned. They were often kicked out of their house by their parents, right? They were often bullied, assaulted, right? Pearl, I got a delivery driver out there. My dog's going nuts. Come here, Pearl. Yeah, so there were lots of good reasons why people kept these secrets, right? It was far more stigmatized than it is now, right? And I think, less cruelty in the world is a good thing, in my opinion, right? And I saw friends of mine suffer because of those things. And, yeah. Yeah, it used to be. I mean, it still happens today that people don't feel safe, and but it happens to much lower extent than it used to, right? People are more accepting of homosexual, bisexual relationships, even asexual sexual orientations, right? And I guess how did all that change in my lifetime, over the last 35, 40 years, right? I'm 53, right? How did that change? Well, you have to talk a little bit about the gay rights movement, right? And the gay rights movement really, unlike a lot of movements, it has a clearly identifiable beginning, right? And it happened in New York City, and the Stonewall riots, right? Sorry, I had a minute. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Stonewall riots. Let me look up. Stonewall was a hotel in Greenwich Village. It's Greenwich Village is artists, people that are, later it's really important for folk music and stuff like that. It's a place where there are gay bars, right? There's artist communities. It's not known for conformity, right? And just the story of how this happens kind of gives you a pretty good idea of how different things were. And this happened in 1969, right? And in 1969 in New York City, in Greenwich Village, right, there were laws about homosexual behavior, right? And there were police vice units that would pose as homosexuals, go into gay bars or places they suspected to be gay bars, and arrest people, right? I mean, thank God we don't see that anymore, right? But when they did this, and they did this regularly, and they would publish people's pictures and out them, right? And some of these people would be married and have jobs that they would lose and stuff like that. And one day they were doing this, and the people at this bar decided they had had enough, right? And they fought back, right? And that's actually the day, right? And most people don't know this, but that's the day that we celebrate Pride, right? That's the beginning of the gay rights movement, right? And yeah, so we've changed quite a lot, right, since then, right? Gone from that, people being arrested, right, and outed, and names and newspapers and stuff like that. People losing their jobs, losing friends and relationships, and parents disowning them if they found out this information about them. To now where they can legally marry, right? And I suppose some people will still want to sanction them and do cruel things to them, but most people do not, right? And so it's been a very effective civil rights movement for homosexuality as well as bisexuality, right? All right. And if you want to know more about that, and I kind of think everyone should know more about that, I kind of looked that Stonewall riots up, and how that unfolded is a great story, right? All right. I guess what else do we need to talk about? Well, I've talked for like 50 minutes. What have I missed? Well, I talked about hooking up. I talked about the sexual revolution, the counter-revolution. I talked about kind of the consensus that most people believe that sexual orientation is rooted in biology, although social experience plays a role, right? Culture plays a role, right? I talked about sex versus gender. That's a really important concept, and how they're not the same, and don't get them confused from here on out, right? And don't use them interchangeably like a lot of people do, right? It just adds to the confusion of these things, right? And I talked about sex characteristics, primary and secondary. I did not really talk about rape and rape myths, but most people know, right? And you've been taught this since you came to the campus, that it used to be believed that most rapes were, a stranger that didn't know the person. They jumped out of a bush, and, well, the truth is that most people are raped by someone that they know, an acquaintance, right? We used to call that date rape, right? Some people still do, right? And there are a number of myths about rape, right? That continue to be fairly pervasive in our society, right? Yeah. I think we talked about most of the stuff. You know what I didn't talk about? Incest taboos. A taboo is something that you're not even supposed to talk about. So I guess I'm violating a taboo right now by talking about it, right? But it's been noted that like every society, every culture has prohibitions against family members having sexual relations with each other, right? This is incest taboos, right? Now, just because we have those norms doesn't mean that people don't violate it, right? I can tell you, as someone that used to work at DHR, right, and you know, um, attempted to intervene in families where there's all sorts of abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, sometimes physical abuse and neglect. That incest is actually much more common than most people think it is, right? That was my experience, right? I used to think it was incredibly uncommon and rare, and then it happens, right? With much greater frequency, right? But incest taboo is universal, right? But how it is applied, like almost all cultures have prohibitions against parents having sex with children, right? But when you extend out further, for example, cousins, you will see some variation, even among states, right? And, some states, it is against the law to marry your first cousin, but other states it's not, right? And that's kind of interesting, right? And I imagine these laws were written a long time ago, and they're probably rarely enforced against cousins, but perhaps occasionally they might be, right? Yeah. And in Alabama, it is legally permissible to marry your first cousin, right? In Mississippi, it is not, right? And when I taught in Mississippi and I lectured about incest taboos and I showed them the same map that appears in this chapter, they always kind of laughed at me and talked about Alabama. And, you know how people from Mississippi make fun of people in Alabama. People from Alabama make fun of Mississippi. Yeah. So it is legally permissible to marry your first cousin in Alabama, but it is not in Mississippi, right? And yeah, that's incest taboos. Well, we don't really talk about prostitution and sex work either, right? And there's some kind of interesting conversations about this. Prostitution for the longest time was thought of as a victimless crime. But a lot of people are like, oh, they're victims. There's people that are exploited in these relationships. There are people who are certainly, in some instances, trafficked, right? So, is it really a victimless crime? Maybe in some cases, maybe not, right? But certainly, people are exploited in all sorts of ways, right? Economically, their bodily integrity, right? Yeah. Differences in power between men and women, differences in class and wealth and income and stuff too, differences in age, older people exploiting younger people and stuff like that, right? So at one time it looked like we would increasingly have more and more permissive attitudes toward prostitution. Some countries they do, where it's actually been legalized. And in some parts of Nevada it has, right? But we're far from that in the state of Alabama, right? And I don't think we're inching closer to that either, because now there's lots of concerns about trafficking of people for sexual purposes, right? And it's increasingly viewed not as a victimless crime, although back in the 60s and 70s it was kind of thought of as a victimless crime, something kind of like drugs or something like that, where maybe there's a victim but it's not clearly identifiable who that victim is, like other crimes like assault, rape, homicide. It's just obvious and clear. Here's the victim and here's the perpetrator, right? All right. Yeah, so I have one question about that. And, how prostitution is regarded by many still as a victimless crime, although it's changing, right? Trafficking now, that's a crime against a person, right? But prostitution is typically thought of as a victimless crime. And so there is that distinction. All right, I'm going to stop talking about sex and sexuality, and I hope I haven't said too much that upset you, offended you, and I hope you thought I have been fair in my discussions of these topics. And take the quiz on this, and then and that'll be it. It'll be due Sunday night, just like all the other quizzes. And in the next chapter that we talk about, I believe, is crime and deviance, and that is something that I am more of an expert in on, and I'll have a lot to say about that. Right? I hope you guys have a nice day, and I hope that you've enjoyed the lecture. Right?